Before going further, we need to clarify the differences in migrations with sqLite and SQL Server because we're going to be making more and more changes to our model as time goes on, right? As we know with sqLite, we are limited to a single migration because at this point, support for sqLite in Entity Framework Core only allows mostly the commands to create tables and fields and everything the first time, but not to alter them afterwards, right? So that's okay. I mean, we can do that. We can use a single migration that fully describes the models that we have, the overall model, the data domain, and that's fine. And we know it's different from SQL Server, right? As our tutorial uses, you can make incremental changes to the model and then create a new migration each time. They're all applied in order, so you end up with the final version as your models would dictate, right? But without that, we're going back to sqLite for the most part. So there's a couple steps involved. Whenever we make a change to the model, we have to basically reset our migration. Okay. You could argue, this is kind of a side point, you could argue that really the database initializer approach shown in the one tutorial makes more sense with sqLite because we're basically initializing the database every time. But I wanted to continue using the migrations approach, even though technically migrations implies multiple migrations, uh, just for compatibility so we can go back and forth between SQL Server and sqLite quite easily that way. And it's not that big a deal. It's just basically three steps. So if we make a change to the model, what we have to do is we have to delete the database. Good thing we have that seed data in place, right? So we can seed it back once we have it up again. By the way, just be careful. You might have to modify seed data depending on the changes you're making to the model. Anyway, we delete the database, then we delete the migration. Now, it's usually just easiest to delete the whole migration folder rather than worrying about going in there and mucking around in the files. And then we add a new we use add migration, right? Especially if we're deleting the folder, make sure you use that -o or output option to specify where the new migrations folder will be created, and then the new migration will be generated inside there. Again, if we use that little text file I showed you, keeping track of these commands, then you can just pull up the same one that's fully complete and just use it over and over again. Okay, so that way you're ready. You could update the database manually, or the code we've learned to put into Program CS should actually look after applying the migration and then calling the seed data all automatically as we run the application. I just want to note that the whole idea of starting migrations over is not limited to sqLite. But even with SQL Server, even though we have this great feature of being able to apply subsequent migrations, that could be really useful, especially if the database is in use, right? If you got people putting data in, you don't want to delete everything and start fresh. But during development, so there are times when sometimes you have a lot of migrations and you can get errors related to applying migrations. So to get out of that situation, often the best fix, or if you just simply want to start fresh, you get so many migrations there, you feel like it's cluttering up things, then as long as you're happy with the current state of your overall model, in other words, you're happy with all the classes, all the changes you've made over time during the development process, and you're confident you're not going to want to roll back or target an earlier version of the design for the data domain, then you can go ahead and reset things, basically start migrations over in pretty much the same way. Main difference is to delete the database, the proper or safest way is to go through the SQL Server Object Explorer, right? If you do that, then you just find the database, right click, say delete, and then the dialog box will come up and you should check off the option to close existing connections. Otherwise, you might be prevented from being able to delete it. And then it's basically the same. Delete all the migrations. And because there's going to be many, perhaps 20, 30, 40, who knows, you might as well just delete the whole folder, just as I suggested with sqLite. And then use the exact same approach, add migration with the -o option. Start fresh with the one new initial migration that has everything there to describe the current model state. Okay, let's just walk through a demo of doing that now. So here's my masks, right? Now, just to come up with something, this is currently set up and using sqLite. So I'm just trying to think, what's an easy change I could do here? Well, let's say, the description is fine, but people aren't consistently entering information about the size, right? Or color or something, right? There's something that's not consistently being put into the description. Let's go with size. So that way we're going to make a separate field. Now I know probably what you're thinking already is that it probably should be a foreign key with a lookup value for size, small, medium, large, and so on. Okay, but let's not get that complicated, okay? I just want to make a change, all right? So give me a break here. So I'm not even going to worry about too much. It'll just be a prop, tab, tab. It'll be a string, tab. By the way, adding a string, technically, I would be able to do this migration without having to worry about existing data because strings can be null anyway, right? But that's a side point. Okay, string, let's go with color. I'm going to go with the Canadian spelling for color, right? Let's say it's required though. Error message. You must specify the color. Okay. And of course, with all strings, we should always put a string length. I'm just going to steal this for simplicity. Up, Control Z, Control Z. And we probably don't need 256 characters for a color. Let's say, I don't know, 20 characters. Okay. All right. Well, that's probably good enough for annotations on the color here, right? Okay. So the problem is that doesn't exist in the database, right? So let's follow our three-step process then. All right, so we have our new mask definition. So I come to the data domain here, or the data folder, the databases, right? I can just delete my face mask. By the way, if you see extra little files showing up just that are like log files and so on, then go ahead and delete them as well, right? So that's been deleted. Okay. If you don't have a bunch of it in here, you could always just delete the whole folder and recreate it again too, for the most part. Okay, so here's my face mask migrations. See, there's multiple files in here, so it's often simpler just to delete the whole thing. All right, now let's get the Package Manager console up. Package Manager console. Give me the console. And here's my commands, my common commands. So I just run this. It'll recreate, because I'm using the -O option here, the actual folder itself, right? It'll add the migration. Oh, I have to give it a name. I usually have started to leave that in with sqLite. You might as well leave the name in here because I always use initial. Could be anything I want, but that's kind of traditional. Okay, so that fully describes. And notice that here in the mask, we now have the color column is being added. Where we go. Now I could update database, but remember this, I just want to point this out. In our Oh, I don't have it here. Never mind then. The code we've started to learn to add to main there that actually calls for the migrations to run, that would take care of it, right? So I don't have seed data or anything in this example. Oh, I should have used a different one, but that's okay. So I'll just do update database. I'm sure that's in here in my commands. By the way, if you get a build error here, I've mentioned this to a few students, and just separately ask for a build. And if there are any build errors, then you get feedback and you can identify exactly what's wrong and go fix it. You kind of skip over that when you're just using the package manager console. Just say, hey, there's a build error, but it doesn't tell you where or what. Okay, so that's it. So as I said, if I had the full code as we started to do in here, it would actually call the update database when we hit .migrate, and then it would call my seed data, and I'd be back up and running with everything, right? So that's the basic process. I just wanted to run through that. And if I was still using SQL Server, right, then I would come in here to the Object Explorer. Okay, this one is still here from earlier on, my first demo. I'm not actually even using it right now, but just to kind of show you graphically what it looks like. So you come in here, I right click, I say delete, and then I'll get this dialog box. So I delete the backup and restore history as well, and close existing connections. I would check that off, click OK, and there we go. It will actually delete it. right? And that would be the proper way to delete a SQL Server database using LocalDB here. And then, of course, I'd do the same thing. I'd delete the migrations folder and recreate it the same way. All right, that's just a quick demo. Hopefully that's, oh, you know what else I should talk about quickly while we're here? Of course, now my mask controller, right? Um, and my mask views, well, they don't show the color, right? They don't have it there. So in this case, I haven't really, have I modified them very much? Let me just see here. Okay, no, I have not. I just double checked. By the way, I did take a moment, put a little bit of sample data in, not very much, but just enough so I'd have something here to work with. But the point is, okay, I have not touched or modified the controller or the views. We haven't done that work to put our drop-down lists in alphabetical order. We haven't added the prompt to select a mask type that's so important, right? So the question is, how do we then get the color on here as well? Because we need to be able to maintain that new field here in the mask collection, right? Well, because we've done no work customizing our example at this point, I do have the option. I can just recreate the whole controller and it will recreate all the views. Don't do this if you've done a lot of customization work, right? Already taking all the select lists and consolidating them together into one place and so on, because you'll lose all that work that you've done. So if I select mask controller, notice it puts a 1 there, right? It's calling it masks 1 because it sees an existing controller. But if I take that, oh, what did I do? Okay, I must have missed it. Okay, if I give it the same name as the existing controller, then it prompts me a file with the name exists. And this will also work with the views as well, right? So it's going to re-scaffold, right, the entire controller and all of the views and automatically add my new field. So that's one option. If it's kind of six of one, half dozen of the other. If you had not actually done much work in customizing the controllers of views, then this can be faster, right? It should just work here because it will add all the necessary code and so on, right? So then now we have our color showing as well, okay? And it's there everywhere throughout all the whole package. When I edit, I can edit the color and so on and so forth. It's required, right? So if I try to save now, I'm getting my error message and so on. So that's one way to bring the user interface up to sync with the new change to the model. But just a warning, odds are very quickly, with the amount of work we're going to be doing in our controllers and views to improve the user experience, add more feedback for errors and so on and so forth, it becomes quickly way too much, right? So how do we make that change? Well, most of it will probably happen in the views. So if I had to manually do it, let's, for example, here, just come to the index view, right? Then really, if color was in here, I would probably just take one of these, copy and paste, and change it to color, right? And same as down here, right? So just, use existing code and bring it over. Just to bring up one more example, edit. Okay, so if we didn't have color, well, then I would probably just steal price, paste it in, and change it, to color instead for all the references and so on. So it's pretty easy usually to find code for a similar field and just put the necessary code in place. So that it can be a bit more work, but less work than starting from scratch with all the customizations we're going to be putting into our controllers and views over time. Side point, but I think it was worth going over. Okay.